This is another special episode of the Drum Show podcast. Again, we took 3 studio drumming legends, sent them the same track, and then dissected what they did differently. None other than Kenny Aronoff is also playing on this one. I think we have Steve Gould and Scott Williamson, incredible players, and it's really fun to see what each one did and their different takes. Not only that, we posted that on my main channel. This, though, we're going to do a deep dive. We're going to kind of do a masterclass. We're going to look at each of their full takes and then an interview with each of them to find out what their thought process was through it. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. So whenever you first got the song, what were your initial thoughts? Because there wasn't a lot of direction given. And so what were your initial thoughts as far as kind of the overall approach to what you wanted to do and why you wanted to do it?
Well, I mean, I'm always operating from my pool of experience and knowledge, right? Like I'm only looking at the world through my eyes. And all of that is informed from just the things that I've seen and done personally, as opposed to, I guess, like some sort of encyclopedia of what the correct or incorrect thing to do is. It's like I'm just unapologetically me.
Right.
And the me that I am is informed by all the things that I've experienced and done. And one of them is, as far as my art, like the various gigs that I've been in, the various bands I've worked with, toured with, recorded, like all that stuff, I've learned a lot from it. And so I oftentimes, when I hear something in a studio setting, something that I'm supposed to play drums on and also compose the part, right? Like I wait for it to inspire me, to kind of like ping my radar of stuff in my past that I've either heard, bands I love, or stuff that I've played. And right out of the gate, this track reminded me of the time that I spent in Owl City.
Okay.
And so I went to that zone, not like this is an automatic robot called Steve Gould playing Owl City music,
right.
But it's a source of inspiration, if nothing else. And so I'm immediately starting to channel everything that I did in that band as like the things that I learned, the things that music required of me, and the things that I that worked well, you know. And one of the immediate lessons in that band was playing on the grid, like playing like timing being just bullseye, because with Corey Wong, for example, or even with Sarah Bareilles or Ben Rector, like a little bit of movement back and forth is not just allowed, but it's kind of celebrated. Like there's a lot of room in the music for the pocket to stretch and, you know, expand or contract. And that's not the case in modern pop, like heavy programmed synth-based music. And it was in Owl City that I really, you know, had to develop the ability to just play all my notes right in the center of the grid. Otherwise, I'm going to be creating constant flam points with all of the programming in the synths and the perk stuff. Like almost every second of the 90 minutes on stage for an Owl City show, there's some sort of programming in the background, and it's busy, you know, like 16th notes or 32nd notes. So I've got to be really aware.
Yeah, and what I think what a lot of people don't understand is whenever you, like the bigger, it's one thing to kind of be off a fraction with that in a smaller club, but the bigger the venue you get in and the farther that's got to go, it's like those very minute, minuscule differences, it's almost like they become larger by the time it reaches the people in the back. So what sounds to you very much like, that's just almost on once it hits the back, or for me, it's almost a flam in effect. It's almost two different hits instead of them just not quite being in sync with each other, which I think is kind of what maybe you're getting at with how gridded you have to be.
Yes, it creates a cluttered sound in the music. And one thing that I think is just absolutely masterful about Adam Young as a composer and like the way that he records music, it's super busy, but it sounds very clean.
Yeah.
And in my experience, busy music, busy performances sounding clean is the result only of accuracy. Like there's no way to play a lot of notes and have it sound clean unless all of your notes are just like perfectly parked in the parking spots, you know, like everything's just like dead in the middle.
Right.
So to get back to your question, that's where my head went when I first listened to that track. I was like, oh, this is kind of an Owl City jam. And I go into, all right, I'm going to have to be like the opposite of swampy, you know, the opposite of Jay Bellerose playing on a T-Bone Burnett track. It's like I've got to play like a computer with my accuracy. That doesn't mean that my hits or my ideas are going to be cold and calculated and boring, but it means my execution needs to be just like bam.
It reminds me of the story I was hearing Stanton Moore tell about a session he was on. Of course, he's, you know, from the Crescent City, and I spent 3 years there living there, and the feel there is just all loosened in the cracks. And he was on a session, he was doing what he felt was this really vibey, you know, spaced down, not quite, you know, with some flams, this tom pattern, and they came in and they're, you know, they thought he was messing up. And he said, no, that's what I think. They said, well, you do something else, because that, you know, because what they were going for, he said, what they were going for was not what I naturally would do, which is this kind of real loose. He said they really wanted a real clean, you know, on the grid type of a pattern instead of that vibe. So I think it's I think it's a really important thing.
And for me, and as often as I get hired to do a whole, you know, spectrum, I mean, that's like, it sounds like Stanton getting hired to do a thing that he wouldn't usually get hired to do, because people think of Stanton more as the like swampy guy. So like, if you want to hire someone to play in the dead center of the grid, maybe don't hire Stanton.
Yeah,
that's
maybe
not what
not
he's known for, right? I'm not necessarily known for any one thing. I'm playing on all of this different stuff, so it's I have to listen to the song and see what it's asking for. Right. So that's part of, again, that like backlog of experience for me. Like, oh, this song reminds me of an Owl City tune. It seems like it's asking me for precision. Yeah. And I guess the other thing I would say about that is when there's busy stuff going on in the, you know, the bass line has kind of had a lot of arpeggiating happening in it, and the other synth stuff that was happening. I've found that larger, longer notes from the drums give space for that other stuff to sit in there, as opposed to trying to be unison with all of that, which again, like if I'm going to try to hit with all of those notes in the programming, odds are I'm going to create some flams because I'm not a perfect like I want to try to play in the dead center of the grid, but not every single note I drop is going to be in the dead center of the grid. So the fewer notes I play, the more space there is for that grid to exist in the background, almost like my note hits, lasts for a while, and is like that decay is filled in by all of that other programming stuff. So that's where I ultimately decided to go with the 4 on the floor for the majority of those like A sections. Like
and I think that's
really like,
I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about, and which is, you know, once you get into the details of actually doing this for a job, you've been in sessions, you understand the issue. Like you were saying, if I'm going to try to hit all of those unisons, but those unisons are made by a computer, you know, they're not other humans that are latching on to you and you guys are moving together. All of a sudden, people default to, it's a really simplistic part, whereas when you really talk to the professional on their side, their ears are hearing, if I don't play that, oh, this is going to get real messy real quick. And I could try to latch onto that part, but at the same time, like you said, it's going to create a lot of problems.
And I mean, truly, man, you use the phrase like simplistic part, like, oh, this is a really simplistic part, like just like boring 4 on the floor or whatever. And the whole like, there's 2 communities in the music world. One of them is drummers evaluating the drum part based on whether or not they're interested in playing it. The other is the rest of us as human beings who are just listening to the music and deciding what sounds good. And like as a drummer myself, coming up as a drummer, thinking like a drummer, the more studio work I did, the more I had to remove myself from that evaluation criteria. Like I'm not assessing a drum part based on whether or not it's quote simple. I'm assessing it based on whether or not it sounds good in the whole of the music. And I'm kind of regularly checking in with this side of my personality that isn't a drummer, that is instead just taste testing the song like anyone else would taste test anything, right? It's almost like a really great, you know, brewer, like a guy who owns his own brewery and brews beer all the time, stops tasting beer just like beer and instead starts tasting it like the chef, like, you know, scientist that he is, and starts having preferences that the rest of the world is like, I don't know, man, Stella's pretty good. I think Stella's just a great beer. And he's like, no, it has to be a triple IPA. And like, whoa, you're a little bit, you know, like I feel that happening in myself, the tension between me as a drummer versus me as a music fan. It's like, what do I want to hear from the drums if I'm not a drummer at all? I kind of just want to hear some pocket that just takes me there instead of something that would be hard to transcribe and hard to practice in the practice room and therefore, you know, not simple. Like simple is good.
And you know, this is, you know, this goes back to whenever I first started playing and then wound up, you know, years later, first getting into teaching online and getting into the mindset of kind of a culture that, because, you know, this makes you sound ancient, but I'm really not that old. Like the internet came around at the tail end of when I was in high school. And so like learning for me didn't happen on the internet, you know. So whenever I had to kind of reverse engineer that, when I got my drum kit, I was up playing on stage within the first couple of weeks at my church, like 3 times that weekend. So I immediately was hit with music, and it was not like, I couldn't pull this slick thing off. I had a piano player whose, you know, left hand was banging out the part for me to like try to keep up with that. And he would tell me afterwards, he's like, just watch my hands and stay with them, you know? And so I'm intensely not thinking anything about the drums. I'm just trying to do that. So all of my early learning was gigs. I mean, I was gigging by 15, you know, but then when it came to teaching online, I was, you know, I started seeing things being taught away from the music, a linear lick or whatever those things are. And I never, it took a long time for it to make sense to me because I'd never learned it that way. I'd always heard what Tony Williams did. And I'm like, is he playing 5 notes in the space of that 4/4 bar? What's he doing there? You know, why is he doing that on a rim click? And then I'd go, oh, that's what they call a quintuplet. Well, why in the world is he doing that? You know? So there's never a thing of me trying to, you know, kind of like what you said, trying to learn hard things for the sake of hard things or play those parts for the sake of that. It was more of a thing of, well, why'd they do that? And then why'd that work in the music? And you know, could I use that ever? So it's an interesting thing to bring up. And something I talk about a lot with my students is you have to listen to music as a musician and not just as a drummer. And we have to pay attention to the energy of the song. You and I talked about this in a text message. I was very concerned with like the energy of the song. Where's it going? Where are the
Right.
ebbs and flows? Where's that taking the listener? Those types of things are way more important to me, you know, in the end than a specific part. I wanted to ask you a question. So when somebody gives you a reference of, I think at the corner of the track, in the corner of the chart, it was like a la the 1975 or something. So in general, when somebody gives you a reference band or artist or something like that, how much does that affect how much of that you go research and go, okay, well, let me see what's happening there? Or how much of it you go, okay, I gave that a listen. Now I'm going to do my thing over that type of a thing. If that question makes sense.
Oh, it totally makes sense. I've had a couple of producers actually get pretty frustrated with me if I go too far in the direction of a reference point. So there's a handful of producers that won't give me any reference at all, even if I ask for one, because they don't want me to just like launch all the way off the deep end of that thing. And then the flip side of it is like, I don't know what you mean exactly when you say 1970. I love that band, but they've got a pretty diverse catalog.
Sure.
Like my guess is he's talking about the first record where there was a lot more like left hand on the hi-hat
type of stuff. Yeah.
Like that's, you know, when I see the 1975 as a reference, like he's probably not talking about all of the like really herky-jerky like glitch programming from the last two records.
Yeah.
But that's as much a component of who they are as a band as, you know, what happened on
their early EP and that first album.
The City, yeah. The City, I think, is the name of the first track off their first record, which has like a really distinct like drum hook to it.
Yeah.
That is just like it's rad. I feel like this happens a lot in this simplification process that we as humans want to like reduce somebody or something down to just like one ingredient because it's easier for us to organize mentally, right? So like people be like, you know, the Steve Jordan thing. And what they're referring to is the way Steve Jordan played on one track from John Mayer's, from this one album.
Yeah, that one album.
Versus the rest of Steve Jordan's entire career. Like for the most part, Steve is using a snare tone that's high and pretty snappy and ringy. And then on Vultures from the Continuum record, he uses one that's like, and it's the first time that a lot of people in the mid 2000s were exposed to that kind of snare tone on like popular music. And it kind of took over and became, at least in studio, you know, the Steve Jordan snare sound. It's like, okay, hold on a second, because statistically, at least, just statistically, that is not the Steve Jordan snare sound.
Yeah.
Like
exactly.
dial up a Robin Ford record or Dave Koz, and that's the snare sound that everybody associates with Steve.
Sure.
At least from where I'm sitting. So, you know, when somebody says like, hey, so like the 1975, I'm like, I wonder which part of the 1975 you're talking about.
Sure. Right.
So luckily I'm a big fan of that band. So I just kind of channel the wholeness of what I think that band is.
Of what you have. Yeah. Yeah. Which is why it's super important to have an eclectic catalog. You know, students often ask, well, when I'm not practicing, what's some things I can be doing, you know, tuning my drums? And I'm like, no, you can be listening like all the time, just listening, because that's, you know, that's one of the things that I love. I played a lot of cover stuff coming up, stage shows, and then wound up in just tons of different cover groups from different genres. And so, you know, by the time I was in my mid-20s, my catalog went pretty far back because I had been forced to learn all of this music. And looking back now, at the time I was like, that's just this cover music. But now I look back and there's so many reference points that I have when somebody calls a band or a style or something like that. So to me, this topic of listening, and just like you being able to spout off, you know, Steve Jordan with this stuff, or, you know, being able to spout that stuff off is something to me that a lot of musicians that I respect their work are able to do, because whenever they're not actively working on this thing, they're actually spending 2 and 3 times as much time going to concerts, listening to records, like just diving in with the headphones on for hours, trying to figure out what's the vibe, why are they doing that, why did the bass player do that, those types of things.
I feel like an ambassador for music listening. Like as often as I can talk to anyone who is a musician about the importance of music listening, it's crazy to me how many of my musician friends don't spend a ton of time listening to anything aside from the music that they need to learn for their gig.
Yeah.
And I'm dead in the water in my creative process. Not even that, like, besides creative process, how about just like my emotional well-being in the world? Like I'm dead in the water if I don't have music to listen to. I'm listening to music relentlessly. And I will say this just as clearly as I can, like to your podcast audience, like listening to music has been 10 times the teacher for me than any individual that I've studied under, or any like, you know, lesson curriculum that I've worked with or book. Like I've not learned anything about the drum set from any source in as heavy of a manner as I have from listening. Just listening to music has been, that is how I do what I do. That is why I do what I do. It's because of all the years that I've spent listening to music.
For sure. And I'll take it even one step further. For me, what helps me when, you know, students will ask, hey, how do I learn a new style of music? Listening to it? Well, not really. I mean, I got this one out. It's like, okay, well, first of all, you need like 10, 20 bands that you are just ingesting in that style. So secondly, do you know anything about the people or the culture or the history of this music, or why it's played in the way it's played, or the original instruments, or, you know, and I've told this story before, but I give the example of me trying to learn second line. So I grew up in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, which is just like 2 hours from New Orleans. And I had been trying to learn second line, you know, with quotations around it for years, you know, and I played the whitest version, just the whitest white guy on the sunniest day version of second line, you know, taka, 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 taka. I couldn't make it feel good. And so the owner would open up the club on Bourbon Street early, and while the bartenders were setting up, he let me come in and practice because I was at an apartment. And I was trying to learn this second line thing, and I just, you know, moved down there. So I'm on Bourbon Street in, you know, the French Quarter, and I'm just playing like this, just sounding just horrible, you know. And he was a drummer himself, raised there, and he'd come up laughing, he'd wave his hand, he's like, no, it's like this. And he would get on there, and it just automatically fell. And I'm like, I'm playing the exact same notes. How in the world does it sound so different? And it wasn't until I really started understanding how the French Quarter smelled at 2 a.m, or until I ate, you know, red beans and rice at Vaughn's at midnight, and Kermit Ruffins and the Backyard Barbecue Swingers were sitting there, you know, playing. It wasn't until like I had these experiences. It wasn't until I saw the street bands and the weddings and the funerals, which is where second line came from. Like, it wasn't until I understood that stuff. And all of a sudden I sat down at the drum kit one day and I started playing it, and it sounded like it was supposed to sound. And I did nothing different except listen and immerse myself in the culture. So for me, that's been as big a part as listening, is trying to understand, where did this come from and why, you know, why was this music made? Why did it come about? Has been super important for me.
That's, you know, the seminal difference between art and science. Science is just the discovery of the natural world and laws that function and apply in many different situations. And art is just the expression of an individual.
Yeah.
And if you want to understand that expression, you got to understand the individual.
Yeah.
Like I remember my teacher telling me, like, don't just transcribe a drummer's parts to try to learn what they do. Watch them after the gig is over, when they try to get paid by the club owner, or when they argue with their girlfriend, or when they, you know, are hanging at the bar just having drinks with their homies. Like, because in all of those instances, they're evidencing the same personality that you hear on the kit. And the notes that you're transcribing will make so much more sense when you see the rest of where they're coming from. You know, like this bar owner that you're talking about, like sitting down at a kit and playing with the swampy thing that you're trying to do. It's like, maybe the dude is like drunk.
Yeah.
Or at least, you know, hungover from the previous night, and that's part of it. And you know, it's like, as scientists, we don't. The instinct of the scientist would be to not include variables like that, because they're cluttering the data. It's like, actually, that is the data.
Yeah, that is the whole thing.
Right.
So I got two more questions. I don't want to keep you too long on this, but I got two more questions for this. And the first one is your treatment of the cymbals. And I
Hmm.
think that's something that a lot of people don't pay enough attention to until they get into a studio, and engineers and producers pay attention to it for them. And that is your touch on the cymbals, and why on a pop song, rock song, why you wouldn't be laying into those.
Well, again, like my experience of what happens to me when I hit cymbals super hard, and how the front of house engineer or how the engineer in the control room at the studio, like how they respond. I've had enough moments of having my wrist slapped, like, hey, you got to back off the cymbals, man. For a lot of my youth, front of house engineers would just say, like, you're playing too loud, but they wouldn't articulate which parts of the kit were too loud. And I had heard so many people that I respected saying, like, you got to play the drums hard. And when I hear like the drums, I think like the drum set. And obviously, as like a 15-year-old kid, I'm discovering that when I slowly open the hi-hats from a tight position to a sloshy position, I can feel the music inflate with energy. And when I switch from the sloshy hi-hats to crashing on the ride, I can feel the music inflate even further with energy. So I start to associate energy in the track with my right hand and where it's hitting on the cymbals. And I start like hitting harder with my right hand in order to achieve more energy. And that's just like a natural progression as a kid of like, oh, this is where energy comes from, the right hand. And then I also hear people like Dave Grohl saying, like, you got to hit the drums hard. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do it. But really what's happening is I'm hitting the cymbals hard.
Right.
My kick drum is not hard at all. And
Yep.
then I get into the weeds with front of house engineers, studio engineers, and they're like, I need more air from your kick drum. I need more decibel from your kick drum, and I need less decibel from your cymbals. And okay, kick drum's with the right foot, cymbals are with the right hand. The right half of my body wants to do the same thing. So when I tell my right foot to hit harder, my right hand is like, sweet, we're going to hit hard too.
Yeah.
Which is also in the background of my experience of like, yeah, that's what I get energy from. So learning how to hit the right hand softly while hitting the right foot heavy was a major hurdle for me. It was probably about age 23, 24. Where I really started tackling that as an important thing. It was, I would be even earlier, maybe like age 20, 21, when I was getting into jazz stuff, and I'm trying to play the ride pretty heavy and hit the kick drum pretty light for jazz. And then in age 25, like pop world, like flip that, and just like learning the dynamic independence of one limb to another, not just the rhythmic independence, but the dynamic independence, which I would suggest is more difficult. Rhythmic independence.
Absolutely.
Rhythmic independence gets a lot of discussion, a lot of hype as far as like drum books and difficult patterns to practice in the practice room, but dynamic independence is much more elusive in my experience. The real catalyst for it was this guy named Michael Bland, who you may know, like played with the Prince, the New Power Generation in the 90s, and has played with the Jonas Brothers and like a whole bunch of people, right? He's a big name in Minneapolis, and I was working with a band that he was producing. He was kind of like MDing and producing this like young, kind of like 30 Seconds to Mars kind of band. And I was not their original drummer. I was like just subbing for like a month worth of shows, and we were at some rehearsals. And he was like, I actually, to be honest, I took the gig to try and to get some FaceTime with him because I knew that he was their producer and MD. I didn't necessarily love their music, but I was like, I'm going to get some in with Michael Bland and try to learn something from him. Just an absolute legend. And after the first like 8 songs of the first rehearsal, he hasn't said much to me. He finally like looks at me, he's like, man, sound pretty good. You're hitting your cymbals too hard. And he's just very direct. And like, okay, that's a specific thing that no one had ever told me. You're hitting your cymbals too hard. People had said you're playing too loud, but they hadn't identified the cymbals. He's like,
right.
You just need to back those off a little bit. Hit the drums just as hard as you're hitting them. Cymbals really need to be like 60% of their actual volume potential at the peak. Like the loudest your cymbals should ever get is 60 of what they could be.
Right.
And I was like, whoa, thanks for that specific, that's really helpful.
That feedback.
And then I started trying to do that. And over the course of the next few tunes, like a couple times, he would look at me and nod and smile like, you're doing, and I was like, okay, I'm doing it. Which I think maybe helped him to feel a little more freedom to like expound on what he had said. And we ended up having a long conversation afterwards. He told me that when they would track stuff at Prince's studio at Paisley Park, Prince only ever wanted to listen back to the take from the overhead mics. Because as far as mixing the record was concerned, the overhead mics are not cymbal mics, they're drum set mics. And he wants to hear the kick drum and the snare drum through the overheads, which means you have to hit the cymbals soft enough and hit the kick and snare hard enough that the overheads are going to hear the whole blend.
Yeah.
And as far as mixing a record is concerned, the direct mics on the snare drum and on the toms and whatever, those are just like frosting. But the cake is the overheads in the rooms.
Yeah, you want to get that sound right.
Exactly. So Prince would make Michael Bland go redo the take if the blend wasn't right in the overheads.
Wow.
As opposed to like, well, I nailed the part, just turn the snare mic up a little bit and it'll sound better. He's like, no, we're not doing that until we get into the mix process when I know that the overheads are what they need to be.
Right.
And that was how Michael learned to do that. And to hear him describe that scenario and realize like, oh, so from then on, I started putting only the overhead mics in my mix. Like when I'm, on a tour or whatever, like I'm just listening to the overheads to force myself to play the cymbals quieter. When I'm in the studio tracking that song for you a couple weeks ago, I'm just listening to the overheads.
Wow.
As a way to force myself to not play the cymbals too loud, and rather to like, if I want to hear more of the snare drum, I just have to hit it in order to hear it.
Many guys will actually have the overheads be the last thing that they bring into their mix because it makes it a washier, harder to deal with mix in your ears because your playing is not under control. The example that I always point students to is an older one, but it was really having to do with their recording technology of the time, and that is Motown, which anytime you had these long-running studios, these are perfect places to dissect why did they do what they did, and if you hear a player not doing something, for instance, hitting a lot of crash cymbals, why weren't they doing that? Why was that? And if you dig into Motown, you have to realize they were all in one room, and recording was not so specific that you had all the various gates and computer technology, and you could just bring this one drum up. Like they had the room mics, they had the overheads, and they had to keep from going into that guy's mic who was sitting 10 feet from them. So you hear the Motown drummers, and James Brown would be another good example. You hear them with a very controlled sound on their cymbal and being very choosy, which is probably not a word, but being very choosy about when they hit that crash cymbal, if they even hit a crash cymbal, because they know if I hit that, then that guy can't be heard. It's going to go through his mic or whatever that may be. And so I think this is a great conversation to have. And I'll kind of put in my 2 cents. When I first started being aware of this, as the same, people tell us I was in a rock band. We were about to cut some tracks for Universal Records, and I was really excited. This was my first, major label time to be in there. And so I'd been touring with this band for 2 years. So I thought this is going to be simple, no problem. Like I've been playing these songs for the 2 they want are the 2 that we've been playing forever. Well, I get in there, had a great engineer, and they can't get control of the sound because of the cymbals. Because I'm just laying into the hi-hats, I'm laying into the rides. So what wound up happening is they took the easiest session and made it the hardest, because they took my cymbals away. And they said, hey, we just want you to cut the drums and then come back and cut the cymbals separately. And kind of like you, I wasn't getting the feedback that I needed to understand, like, no, we can do these 2 together if you'll adjust your playing. And so, I'm playing on pieces of foam mounted on my cymbal stand, trying to figure out why in the world they have just done this thing to me, where they're taking apart my parts. And that was the reason. Later dissecting that whole experience, I realized, oh, you were the issue. Like it wasn't the cymbals, it wasn't the overhead, it wasn't the room. You were the problem.
And in that instance, it's also like it's a huge ask for the producer to be like, hey, can you just back off your cymbals but not back off your drums? Because most drummers, if they've never been asked to do that, that was true of me when I was like, it was really hard.
Yeah.
And when you're in the pressure of just like being under the microscope in the recording studio. There's a lot going on in your head, and somebody's like, "Hey, by the way, can you just? I mean, no big deal, but can you like back off your right hand, even though no one's ever asked you to do that before?" Like, odds are probably not. So instead, they're just like, "We're gonna skate straight past that invitation and instead take your cymbals from you entirely." Which is, I mean, there are a lot of people that have that exact story that you just shared in recording studios.
Yeah, so it's a great discussion, and one that's not had enough. Just mixing your own sound.
Well, because it's not sexy.
No, it's not.
Right?
Sexy.
Like it's really, really difficult work to gain that kind of control, and nobody in the drum magazine is going to give you a shout out for it. You're not going to get any additional Instagram followers because of that. Instead, you're just going to get a better sound, and maybe you're going to get some more gigs. But for somebody who's not in the gig world, it's like, why would I even bother?
Yeah,
like I'm not trying, I'm not trying to talk myself up here. I'm just saying, like, this took that kind of control took a long time to acquire, and nobody applauded me afterwards, except the occasional front of house engineer who says, "Wow, I really appreciate how you control your cymbals."
Yeah,
oh, great.
And the only applause you get is whenever the gig goes right, and no one noticed you. They just noticed how great the music was, and they walked away and they were like, "I could hear everything perfectly." It was like a perfect night. That couple that goes on the date to see their favorite band, and they walk away from that experience having had a memorable night. And your part in that was not bashing the crap out of your cymbals so the rest of the band can't hear it. Can't be heard, and the sound guy can. It sounds like such a small thing, but on a large scale, it becomes very much a part of the music and the experience that you're, as an artist, trying to translate to the person ingesting that experience, if you will.
The church in Phoenix that I've spent the last 5 years at, we've got a ton of drummers because there's all of these campuses, right? There's 10 different locations. And when quarantine started here in the global pandemic that we're living in now, right? Like when all this happened, the church isn't having services anymore, and they kind of reconstructed the stage of the main auditorium to be almost like a television studio with these screens everywhere. It looked pretty rad, but because the screens were everywhere, the sound of the cymbal bleed was suddenly omnipresent in all the vocalist mics. And I had to play super light touch on the cymbals in order for that to blend well for the live stream service. And I started suggesting, like, hey, let's get some of the other drummers in to do the live stream, because this, we're on camera. We're not, all the other guys are just like sitting at home. It's quarantine. They're like, and the engineer was like, I don't think I trust any of them to do that. Like, I need you to be hitting the cymbals really lightly the way you are, and I don't think any of the other drummers are going to do that.
I had a similar experience at a church in California a couple years ago doing a women's conference, and I went in and I got on the drum kit. First of all, complete enclosure, like there's a door to come in, like they had closed the drummer off completely. And then when I sat down on the drums, they were all completely detuned and muted as much as possible, and really dead cymbals, or really, I should say, washy cymbals, so they're not real cutting. And whenever I had to hit the snare so hard to get it to come through, and I asked the sound guy, I said, "Man, is there a gate?" "Oh yeah, there's a gate on there." I was like, okay. So at that point, I understood what was happening. He had 3 or 4 animals coming in every week that he was just taking their toys, essentially. Okay, just tune them so I don't have to deal with the overtones. Let's dead cymbals, just put them in a room by themselves, and I'll put heavy gates on them. And it was a real discussion, like, hey man, you're going to have to trust me here and take those off, and I'm going to tune the drums because they sound awful. I know you can make it sound right back there, but they sound really bad up here. So it's a very real thing.
That trust from him, like, it's nice of him to trust you to do that, but a lot of sound engineers in churches in particular, if they've only ever worked with church volunteers, they have no reason to trust you, because most church volunteer drummers haven't done the work that I'm describing, which, again, I'm not trying to like make anybody feel bad. It's more just like, what is the thing that separates the good from the great in that particular world? It's a dynamic issue that's really hard to come by, and doesn't have on the other end of it the reward of just like learning a new rudiment that you can immediately apply to all your cool fills or whatever. But suddenly, once you do have that dynamic ability, the sound engineer is like, oh, I don't have to put you in a cage anymore. You can actually just be on the stage with the rest of the band. Which is like, oh, that's nice. This cage has always been a little bit insulting, and the front of house engineer is like, yeah, but that's your fault because you're playing the system too loud.
I got one more question for you on this whole topic.
Okay.
If my research is correct, you took some from Dave Keane, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I studied with Dave intensely from 1999 through 2001.
Okay, super jealous, by the way. So I took. He's been a favorite of mine since I heard the album the Bad Plus have with the orange cover and space guy on it. Not These Are the Vistas.
Right.
Cheney Pinata just threw my brain for a loop in college. Like, what the heck?
Yeah, man.
Feel. So I took a lesson from him not too long ago because he's off the road, obviously, and teaching, and we'll probably take a follow-up, a couple of them probably before he stops. A fantastic lesson just on opening yourself up creatively. So the short, question for you is, how did his teach? Because he's very much an experimental player, very much the opposite of the type of gigs that you're playing right now. In my mind, if I had to do the two, the groups he plays with are pretty opposite from an Owl City or a Cerberellus or something like that. How did his teaching really mold you and help you in your interpretation of modern pop music, rock music, those types of things?
Well, that's a great question. I love that you're asking this. Dave introduced me to, as far as my music listening background, it was junior year of high school that I got into jazz. And as a result, I totally missed OK Computer by Radiohead, like a really important rock album.
Huge.
I was smack in the middle of the demographic that should have been life changed by that album. But I was totally caught up in just like John Coltrane. And I started studying with Dave for that reason, because he was known in the Twin Cities as a jazz drummer. And I wanted him to teach me about jazz, but he also introduced me to Radiohead. He was like, "Oh, you've never heard OK Computer? This is an important record." And I actually don't love Phil Selway as a drummer, but on that album, or just like in that band, it's important. And I never knew. And I kind of needed somebody who I looked up to. I was just kind of like, wait, you want me to listen to something that's like not jazz? I thought we were just going to be jazz guys. Because you're a jazz guy and I want to be a jazz. He's like, yeah. You gotta be informed by everything, Steve. Like, he's turning me on to Rush. He's turning me on to Zeppelin. He's turning me on to Bjork, D'Angelo, The Flaming Lips, bands that are really important, artists that are really important in my pedigree as a music listener that aren't just jazz artists. Which is to say, he did the same thing on just like the larger like music level, as opposed to just the drummer level. Dave wasn't a drum teacher for me. He was a music teacher. He was an art teacher. Like, we talked a ton about painters. Like, he wanted to talk about Jean-Michel Basquiat. He wanted to talk about Andy Warhol. He wanted to talk about Mark Rothko. He didn't want to just talk about Neil Peart. And like, we would spend a lot of time in this creative improvisation zone. Like, one of the things he would have me do is play improvisations all the time for him. Like, tell me a story, Steve. Like, use your drums and tell me a story from start to finish. Pretend I'm your kid and you're my dad and you need to tell me a bedtime story, but you're going to just use drums to do it. And that act of improvising, I had never really dug into that way. And then he would walk over and take my hi-hats away and set the hi-hats on the other side of the room. Be like, tell me another story, but now you don't have the hi-hat. That kind of stuff transcends genre, as far as I'm concerned. Those kinds of lessons are so much larger than just how to play in Sarah Bareilles' band versus how to play in the Bad Plus.
Right.
And that's what I learned from him, which I was then able to take into Sarah Bareilles' band. Like, and I would say this too, functionally, as far as the drums are concerned, the limb independence thing that I did with Dave was freakish. Like, there were assignments that he was giving me that I had to spend 3 hours a week every day between now and next Friday when we have our next lesson, if I'm going to get the assignment done.
Just to be able to do it.
And I'm so enamored with this guy that I want to impress him, so I want to get the assignment done. I'm also like really excited about the progress I'm feeling, so I want to get the next assignment, but he won't give me the next assignment until I get this assignment done. But in order for me to get this assignment done, I have to actually practice 3 hours every day for the next week, which that makes a difference, man. Like if you want to see a footprint on your playing, spend 3 hours every day on one task, like because the task is so difficult.
Yeah.
And all of that limb independent stuff, a lot of it stemmed from Alan Dawson and Alan Dawson's method using the Ted Reed Progressive Steps to Syncopation book. But anyway, like going through all of that really opened up the physical resistance that my body would give against my ideas. So like if I'm improvising on the drums, I'm like, oh, I want to do this, and my right leg is like, tough, we're not going to do that. Like my body's just like, nope. Versus after all of that limb independent study, I'm like, hey, I want to do this, and my arms and legs are like, sweet, we can do whatever you want, man. That's cool. I mean, obviously within reason. Like I can't play 30-second notes at 120 BPM with just my left foot, or right. I mean, like there's impossibilities on the drum set, but extensive limb independent study removes a lot of the barriers that it removed a lot of the barriers that I had to my own ideas prior to that. So, you know, here's the 1-2 punch of Dave putting me through this rigorous limb independent study, but then also kind of transcending all of that with just like art and music lessons, as opposed to here's how you play jazz, and jazz is the only thing that matters, and make sure you're a jazz drummer. So, I mean, like these days when people tell me that I don't play like someone they would picture studying with Dave King, I take that as simultaneously a compliment, like great, because I don't want to just be a carbon copy of that guy.
Right.
Like it's a compliment for me as a player. It's also a compliment to him as a teacher, that he could have the impact on me that he did, and yet I'm not just a carbon copy of him. Like that's a good teacher right there. Like honestly, I owe the majority of my success in my career to the time that I spent with that guy.
I've referred so many people to, you know, I don't know if they wound up taking any from him, but now that he's kind of opened up his schedule for the rest of this year, I was telling somebody just yesterday, like, you have to take a lesson from him. You know, you get 1 or 2, get as many as you can while he's off the road and he's doing this, because he's such a great teacher and such a, you know, for some out of left field teacher. And kind of back what you were saying about, you know, the mix between art and music, which music is art. But I was talking to a sax player in college who was just he was always winning these competitions, always winning, you know, amazing player. I said, hey, whenever you were, you know, when you're soloing, what are you thinking about? And he said, so I think a lot about shapes. And of course, you know, I'm sitting there 18, new in college. I'm like, oh, okay, well, what are you really thinking about? Yeah. And
right.
And he's like, sometimes I'm thinking about colors. And I'm like, this guy, okay, like you don't have to josh me because I'm a freshman, you know, you can just, and he's like, you know, and I'm trying to figure out how to connect those and what shape I could make with the next one. And that was kind of my first dive into trying to do something besides just play the drums. And it's like the way that Raymond Weber, who is kind of a local legend in New Orleans, he played on Harry Connick Jr. She and Star Turtle album and a ton of other stuff, just a great player. Whenever he talked about playing Brick House, he's like, you got to think about the right things. He's like, when I'm thinking about a big, fine black woman walking down the street, you know, he's like, she's a brick house, you know, I'm not sitting there thinking about what I'm gonna have for lunch. He's like, I got to put myself in the right mental state. And so for a lot of students, when it comes to soloing, they'll come in and they say, well, I can't solo. I say, no, you can, you're just blocked up. So let's see if we can unblock you. And because if you can play 8 notes, you can solo. And so we'll start with those things. And I'll tell them, have you ever tried to tell a sad moment on the drums? You know, have you ever thought about a breakup you had and wondered, I wonder if I could play that? Or maybe the day you got married or the day your kid was born, like, can you take that moment in time and then can you play that? And then a lot of them kind of look at you like puppy dog sideways, like, oh, what are you talking about? It's like, I know it doesn't make sense, but can you play it? Can you make it make sense? And can you convey that story to someone, even if they don't know what you're talking about? But can you convey that emotion, I guess, that you're feeling of that? And I think too often, especially these days, we separate those two things. It's very easy to do.
It seems apparent to me, it seems obvious to me that the emotional quotient in music is what draws human beings to music. Like the way this music makes me feel is why I like listening to it. Now, if you want to become a musician, you've got to learn about the technical quotient. You've got to learn about the logistics. the mechanics. You can't just focus on the emotion the way you do if you're just a listener, right? And the more you get into the musician side of things, the more mechanics you learn, the more logistics you learn, the easier it is to forget that there ever was an emotional quotient. Mm-hmm. And you come out the other end thinking this is all just a calculator, math problem, scientist game. It's like, no. Remember, I feel like the exercises you're just describing, channel the feeling you had when your kid was born and play that for me. It's an emotional game. Like, you're talking about emotional stuff. As a musician myself, I so benefited from someone in my life giving me both logistics and mechanics and technique coaching, but never letting me, like Dave said to me, he's like, we're going to learn all these rudiments, and then we're going to have a book burning, what would I call it? Like a ceremony. We're going to take all of the rudiments that you learned and we're going to burn them, because I never want you to think about them again. Yeah. Because they're not worth thought. Because music is about how you feel. It's not about doing a math problem about which rudiment is going to fit where. Right. You got to get that stuff ingrained, and then you got to stop thinking. You got to stop thinking about it. Yeah. There's no time. You got to think about how you feel.
100%. Well, man, I sure do appreciate you giving us your time, and I don't want to keep you around forever, but thanks for doing the project. You sounded amazing.
Thank you, dude. I really appreciate you inviting me into it. I had a blast.
It was a blast. And if you ever, it's stevegould.com, correct? They can find you at?
Yeah. My, like if you're not on Instagram or whatever, stevegould.com is my homepage, and I've got, YouTube channel and that kind of thing too.
Awesome. Well, thanks for being on here.
You bet. Thank you, Steven.
So when you got the track, what are some first initial thoughts that you kind of went through as you're just listening to it and trying to get your head around what exactly the track is?
Well, it definitely wasn't like AC/DC, and it wasn't, the Beatles, and it had a little bit of a kind of a more of a subtle approach, as opposed to just smashing out real hard and aggressive. And I like to think of myself as a very musical drummer, because I'm the same guy who toured with the Smashing Pumpkins and recorded with Tony Iommi and Alice Cooper, but I'm the guy who also recorded and was asked to tour with the Highwaymen, which is Johnny Cash, Willie Nelson, Chris Christopherson, Waylon Jennings. And the way I play with those guys is different than what I would do with these other guys. So this had a little bit of I played probably at 85% volume because it had a little bit more of an R&B influence to it, and it wasn't just pure hard rock. It had a lot of different things to it, and so that's why I immediately went to the hi-hat, playing the 16th notes to go with the guitar that was playing 16th notes, 2 and 4 to establish time, but just in a cool way. The song had a cool vibe to it. That's my point. Very cool. So I approached it very cool, and but obviously I knew that was the intro, and I had to make a statement, a fill to come into the groove, and that's why I decided, okay, well, I'm going to do something from a different maybe style, and that's why I think I did a sextuplet, and put the 6 on the bass drum and a flam on 1. That was to kind of wake everybody up and say, hey, I'm here. And the believe it or not, so playing 2 and 4, the challenge at that intro was I was hitting all those ging, 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 those chimes, and on your chart it was all written out, so I had to practice keeping my bass drum on 2 and 4 perfectly in the groove while I hit all those accents on the cymbals. And I don't do that every day, so I had to actually practice that.
You know what I found was interesting when I finally got to listen back to all of them, was that 3 of us chose in the beginning to bring the kick drum in on 2 and 4.
No, wild.
Gould was the one that decided that he was going to come in, up front, but the rest of us brought in that kick drum on 2 and 4, which was interesting to me. That 3 different players decided to do the exact same thing in a little bit of a different way.
Yeah, that blew me away too, because I was going I was so excited to hear what everybody else did. I was going, oh my God, I can't wait to see what they're doing. And I guess the reason why, for me, I instinctively went there is because I needed to do something that kept time, but something that was subtle, and the snare drum's loud. We could have, I guess, done it all on the hi-hat. We could have just done the hi-hat. But for some reason, I felt like I wanted a little bit more power, and the kick drum was a little bit more powerful. That's the only way I can explain it.
It's about drive too for me.
Yeah.
A lot of times with students, I'll tell them, if we drop all that bottom end down, you got the band doing some kind of cool part, but it's just not working. For me, a lot of times I look at, okay, is there anything driving this at this point, or is everybody doing their part and there's nothing centering
Right.
it? Just giving it that kind of that arrow point to kind of push the song ahead.
Yeah.
And for me, that was kind of what I was like, okay, it needs a little something to drive here, but it doesn't need the full Monty yet. Like, we don't need to put that in yet.
Well, the kick drum was playing on 2/4 the backbeat, because they're all going, someone's got to go boom, hand claps, kick drums, snare drums, something. We put it in the bottom, and it was really actually musically very smart, because sonically there was nothing down there. There was no bass, there was nothing. Kick drums down there, all the other stuff's up top, including our hi-hat,
Yeah.
So that's it. It seemed like a real logical choice. Now, what would you have done what would your option B be? What would you have done if let's say I had you say, nah, don't do that, do something different? What would you do?
So I had a hard time with this track because Scott and I were talking about this. I
Yeah.
had the same thought he had, in that his first inclination was, this doesn't need live drums, it needs to have programmed drums, because of how gridded everything was and how the song was composed. If I would have come in on a session, that would have actually been my suggestion of, I know you hired me, but you may want to look into having a programmed drum part and see what that does, because I feel it may fit this. For me, so I honestly had trouble, because my first instinct was, I think you want a machine. I think you want the machines to take over on this one.
Yeah.
But with that, if it wouldn't have been 2 and 4, I would have come in very similar to how Gould did, and I would have had that very small intro section, and then come in strong with an intro before that verse section.
Yeah.
When it went into the chorus first. I would have given it, I couldn't have left it with nothing. It had to have something. It would have lost that energy and drive.
Yeah, I was thinking of possibly doing cross stick on 4s.
Yeah.
Yeah, just a tick tock type thing.
Yeah,
Um,
that I considered that at the intro as well. That Motown,
yeah, yeah,
"Ain't Too Proud to Beg"
yeah,
type of thing
exactly.
coming in. Now, you and I had an interesting conversation that I think is not often had outside of a studio. In that you weren't real happy with the first take, and you
Sure.
kind of came back to it. You
Yeah, there
weren't.
was something happening when that bass line came in, and you're right. It just didn't sit right. I don't know. It was hard to define. I
Yeah,
noticed that.
everybody knows before you go on. I didn't hear anything. It wasn't anybody that went back to Kenny and said, "Hey, this isn't working." He just listened back to it later and said, "Something's not good."
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I did it again and again and again to get that part right. It was where my kick drum and the bass when I came in was busy, and I had to get my bass drum to have the same feel as the bass guitar. It's hard to put it. All I know is from a producer's ears, I was going, something's not right, and I instinctively wanted to play with the click. And for everybody listening, the first question I always ask everybody is like, the parts I'm playing to, the bass, the guitar, whatever else is there, are those keepers? If they're keeping those parts, it doesn't matter where the click is. I have to blend in with the other musicians, so it sounds like we're in a band together. I could be right, perfectly with the click, and it doesn't sound right.
Yeah.
That was the challenge.
For those of you that don't really quite understand that, whenever you're playing with live humans, they have a heartbeat and a rhythm and a human feel. So everybody's gonna sit on that click a little bit differently.
Yeah.
The cool thing live is you sit as a unit. You don't have a bass player. Well, hopefully, you don't have a bass player that's pulling way ahead of you. And you have everyone that has established a feel and a tempo, and that's the magic of live music. It's 3 or 4 musicians all in sync, and if it does speed up 2 BPM, the entire band's kind of going that way, kind of like Honky Tonk Women speeds up 10 or 15 BPM throughout the whole song. You don't notice that.
You don't notice it at all.
Moving with it together,
Yeah, totally.
So it's that human vibe of having to understand. If you go with this musician and it's not a keeper track, somebody else comes and cuts on it and doesn't go with you, they go with the click, you will fight each other in the final mix. And the listener will say, I don't like it. They won't tell you why they don't like it.
Yeah.
They'll just say, it doesn't sound good. It doesn't sound right. I don't like it. I can't dance to it.
Yeah.
Whereas when you get down to it, you have to understand why the scientific reason of like, why can you not dance to it? Well, I can't dance to it because one's playing with the click and one's, ignoring the click, and they're not in sync with each other.
I totally agree. I love it when somebody says to me, hey man, make sure you play on top of the beat. And I'm like, okay, let me ask you something. Are you keeping all these parts? No, we're going to replace everything. I went, well, you understand, if whatever I play, if a guitar player plays on top of me, I'm going to sound behind. But if the guitar player plays behind me, I'm going to sound on top. So, it's up to you. I have no control of this. All I can do is play with the click, and then you decide how I sound later. I mean...
And it was interesting talking with Steve Gould. Because he played with an artist named Owl City. And Owl City is a very, very programmed, electronic, very on the grid.
Yeah.
All of his stuff, lots of perk parts, lots of side chains, different synth parts, and they're all very gridded.
Yeah.
And we were having the discussion of, if you play those parts and you get off from them at all, it sounds really messy.
Yeah.
Busy music sounds good when it's clean.
Yeah.
Whenever it starts sounding sloppy, that's when people's ears start telling them this doesn't sound great. And
Right.
when you start getting in a bigger venue, small clubs, it doesn't matter as much. You can hear it, but the bigger the venue, the more those notes start to separate. And I was talking to was it Taylor Swift's drummer at one point? And we were talking about this, and he was talking about how gridded her music had become, and he said there are things that I'll actually have to program slightly off because of the different percussion loops they have on there, and they're slightly off. He said by the time that gets to the back of the stadium,
Yeah.
we're way off. You know,
Yeah.
things are way separated.
Yeah.
These are the nuances they don't talk about in music school, where it's like, you know, it's kind of the streets coming in of like, why does that sound dirty? You know, I played the same notes.
Well, I think the bottom line is, as drummers, we need to be like, have producers' ears, stand outside of ourselves and listen. How in my case, how does Kenny sound with this track right now, or this band? I mean, oh my God, dude, I was just recording 2 days ago, and I said to the guy, I said, you know, are you keeping those parts? He said, yeah. I said, well, dude, they're not really locked up with the click, so you're gonna have to. It's a little bit of a mess. I think you might want to have to redo those parts, because it's just not locked up. But
Yeah.
you know.
So whenever you went to the bridge section, you decided to go to halftime. Was that a gut reaction, or what?
Yeah,
What made
that
you
was
think-
a total gut reaction, because I wanted release from what we were doing. I wanted it, and it just felt like, and the way the music sounded, it sounded halftime to me. You know,
Yeah.
well, I can't sing, so I'm just going to tell you. Take my word for it. It felt halftime. But I had stepped back at one point and went, wow, I could do this a different way. But I just committed to the halftime and hitting all those accents, you know, that was in the music, you know.
Yeah. So, you know, I had a similar reaction in that I wanted somewhere else to go from it.
Yeah.
And I didn't go quite to halftime. So I heard there was a hit on 1 and like this accent on 4.
Yes, exactly.
That almost made it feel like another, you know, almost made it feel like it was cutting the bar short.
Yeah.
And dropping a beat, but it wasn't. And so I went to a somewhat of a halftime, except snare on 4.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good option.
I kept the hi-hats on the upbeats because I was like, that'll, you know, keep the energy driving. And,
Yeah.
you know, but the biggest thing I wrestle with these songs is, you know, where's the energy going? Where are we building? Where are we coming? Kind of like you said, it felt like we needed a release from what was happening there. Go ahead.
Yeah, and not only a release, but then where are you going? It sets it up beautifully from that, you know, from that point on, you know, because you went to halftime, and you can't wait for that chorus to come back in.
Yeah, and that's, you know, I think a lot of drummers don't think like a producer or a songwriter, where they think about the energy. Where are we taking this? And I've told so many students, like, okay, so we're at 11 right now. If we're in the Spinal Tap movie, our amp's on 11, right?
Yeah.
Where are we headed now? Because we're at the, you know, we're at the pre-chorus for the first chorus, and we've just hit the climax of the song. We can't go anywhere else. So where do we go? So that's where I always try to pull them back and go, is there a way we can build to that climax a little bit later? Almost like a storyboard for a movie, if you will, you know?
Totally. I totally think of myself, I look at myself as an actor in a movie. Every song is a movie, and I'm just, who are you in this movie? What is your role?
So I got one more question for you. I don't want to, you know, keep you too long. I know you got a bunch going on. So my question is, and we've had this discussion with Scott and Steve, just kind of went there. And so I thought, instead of just going to this time, we just kind of bring the topic up. And that is, how much importance do you place on the influences that you've gotten from listening to other music? In other words, you know, the book knowledge, which is fantastic, but also the street knowledge of actually just listening, because I have a lot of students that they want to know what they can do outside of practice time. I just got off a student call with a bunch of students, and I was just went on and on for like 5 minutes about, guys, I cannot stress enough how much you need to be listening to music. Every chance you get, you're working out, you're driving, you're at the airport, you're waiting in line for coffee, you know, you're sitting at home, listen. To you and your career, how important is that
Well, listening is important. Of course, my career got so crazy that all I could do was listen to the songs I'm learning and making charts for the session. Like last year in November, I remember I did like 3 days in Vegas with Fogerty. Then I got on a jet and flew to Moscow. And when I landed, I had to go to the Kremlin to play with this band that we're going to film and record 34 songs of their 50th anniversary, last concert ever, real famous band. Well, they were there for 10 days rehearsing. I showed up the night before, so I had 34 charts written out. So on my flight to Moscow, I was just listening and reading my charts and rehearsing. And that really, really was important because it's in order to, it's almost like you're visualizing what you're going to do so that you can do it. But aside from that, to answer your question, yeah, listening is very important because it's like being in school. It teaches you so much. And when you hear something, it is going into you, and you are affected by listening as much as playing. Yeah. I really do think so. They did a study. They gave these NBA basketball players. They had these NBA basketball players do free throws for an hour. They had another group of people do free throws just visualizing. And when they all got together and did free throws again, the ones that were doing it actually for an hour, they improved by 24%. The visualizers improved by 23%. Only 1% off because of the visualization. And that's what listening is.
Yeah, it 100% is.
It really works. It really does. It does have an effect on your learning when you're listening.
Well, man, I sure do appreciate you being a part of the project. This was
Thank you.
A really fun one, and the feedback I'm getting from people, they're really loving it, and the value they're getting from being able to see everyone's different take on it.
It's incredible.
Has been really rewarding for a lot of them, and being able to just see what different players would do.
Oh, dude, it's brilliant. Yeah, and you're an incredible host and MC, and the whole project is so amazing. I was like, I've never done anything like that before. It's a great idea. It's brilliant. Brilliant.
Well, I sure do appreciate the kind words, and I appreciate you hanging. What were your initial thoughts whenever you gave it the first listen through?
Well, when I listened to it, what it sounded to me like I walked into a recording session and there's a track and it's supposed to be programmed, and the producer decided he didn't like the program. He wants a real drummer, but it still needs to retain some of that, heavily edited feel to it. And I just, for some reason, that was my first thought is, okay, there's a producer. He's told me he wants something slightly more live than what this is programmed, but still kind of play programmed. And so that's what I did.
It's funny because that is the initial thought I had whenever I got the track and was listening through to it. I thought, did we go too far to the program side? Because that was my complete initial reaction was, this doesn't need live drums. This exactly like you said, this is this is a chance where the machines can take over and just take this one and run with it. So when you're going into that type of a situation where your I guess your better judgment and your experience is telling you that this should be one way, how do you approach coming up with a part for something like this that has a lot of gridded parts, a lot of percussion going on, those types of things? How do you approach that?
Well, I think we talked about this on the last round. For me, it's always about figuring out what does the song require of me. And of course, the answer to that question is not always just one answer. There can sometimes be a few different rabbit trails you could chase that would lead to a good result. And in most situations, if I were in the studio with the producer, there would be some guidance. In this case, we were all just kind of, okay, do what you would do, kind of left to your own devices. And there was enough 16th note information happening in the guitars, and of course the sidechain synth and bass stuff going on in different places, that it seemed to me maybe just a 4 on the floor with some 16th note hi-hats would be the way to reinforce the subdivisions, but still kind of stay out of the way. Again, I was trying to think, well, if I was going to program this, or if somebody else was doing it, what do I suppose they might do? How could I find a way to play it sort of like that while still trying to maintain some level of a live feel to it, so it doesn't sound too terribly, quote unquote, beat detected or edited, but in a way it kind of does. I don't know if that makes any sense, but essentially, again, it's always just about figuring out what's going to be the best way to serve the song.
Right. When we talked about this with the last one, it not having any lyrics and how that kind of played into what you were doing. So in other words, a little bit more space. This track to me, there are a couple of vocal lines here and there, but in large part it was a pop track with no vocals. Were you cutting this as if vocals would come later, or were you just dealing with information that was given right at hand?
My recollection is that you guys sent me essentially what the track was going to be. That little vocal line that sits kind of underneath everything was there, and so but it also felt almost more like a color than a significant part of the track, and so I'm trying to pay attention to every element that's there, but for whatever reason, that didn't strike me as the thing I needed to trouble myself with the most.
Right.
Sense. But
yeah,
you can't ignore anything when you're playing a track. You've got to try to pay attention to everything.
So, and I talked about this with Steve as well, Steve Gould. When it came to, because many times you'll be on a session and you'll be given a reference, whether that be a reference vibe or a reference band or a reference drummer. Whenever you're giving something, and that was really the only information you were giving, here's the song, here's the project, And this is a pop song a la, I think it was on the chart somewhere, a la the 1975, which is a more current pop band. When you're given something like that, how much does that play into, okay, I'm going to go with my natural instincts, or okay, so let me go figure out what they're talking about here with that?
All input has to be taken into consideration. It's funny, sometimes you'll get a producer that comes in and says, here's what I'm looking for. They'll play you references, and it could be anything. And then by the time you're done with the track, you're nowhere near what
Right.
you thought it was supposed to be. Either because the producer changed his mind, or maybe he just wasn't as sure of himself or herself as they ought to have been. So other times you'll work with folks who have a very specific vision and they just don't play the drums. So they've hired you to sort of be their hands and feet. But if somebody says to me, I want this to sound like X, I'm going to pay attention to that. And the only time I would resist that kind of instruction is if I listened to it and just maybe made a quick phone call and said, are we sure that's the direction we want? Because for whatever reason, that isn't registering with me. But it's always about what the people paying you to do the job are asking you to do. And sometimes that means that you go against your instincts.
Right.
Which can oftentimes end up with a really cool result, because you're playing a little bit against yourself, which makes you think differently. And there are some very wise producers who will do that on purpose to try and create a soundscape that nobody's really expecting, and it can end up being really cool.
Right. So and something I deal with whenever given references like that, do you ever get caught up with going too far down the hole of the reference artist that they have told you, and getting too in your head about, am I representing this sonically, and as well, what are they using on the drum kit? What are they, do you ever go too far down that hole where it actually clogs you up some?
That can certainly happen. That's why in any situation, again, whether you're working by yourself or with a group of people or just with a producer, the goal always has to be to figure out, what does the song want from us here? And so, yeah, you have to be careful not to get too married to a specific approach. Obviously, if you're doing a sound alike, then, if somebody says this is for instance, like it's a jingle and it has to sound exactly like Billie Eilish or the Killers or something, whatever it happens to be, well, then you know what the call is. If it's more of a, hey, here's a reference that we kind of are hearing something like this, then yes, you've got to be very careful not to get too married to that, because you might miss some opportunities. And as I think you were implying, occasionally if you go too far into that wormhole, you can actually end up screwing the song up a little bit. So it's always sort of this internal intellectual war with ourselves of going, okay, I know what I think this is supposed to be. I know what's going to sound great, or at least I think I do. And how can I try to do that and serve both the song and the client? And there's, so many considerations.
And this kind of gets into the topic of something that I spoke with the others about, and that is, you have book information, which is good. We should learn, the rules of our instrument and kind of how that is. The same way my son should learn the rules of dating before he takes a girl out. He should definitely know how to treat a lady properly when he takes her out. But at the same time, there's a lot of situations that happen on a date that they don't cover in the manual of, this is how you take a girl out to dinner. And so I think it's the same with music. And so it kind of brings up the topic of, I get asked so much, when I'm not practicing, what can I be doing? What can I be? And my answer is always, well, you could be listening to music like all the time, anytime, all the time. And so how how important is listening to music? Is the catalog, the body of music that you have knowledge of, how important is that in how you approach songs versus the schooled knowledge that you've gotten in the past?
Well, it's certainly both and. They're not mutually exclusive principles. We've got to understand our instrument and how to play it. That's really important. But if our goal is to play music and not just play the drums, well, how do you learn to play music? By listening to music, by absorbing it, by becoming a student of it. And I hate to be redundant. We may have talked about this some on the last round, but having a wide vocabulary of musical tools to choose from is really, really critical, because there's always going to be some client that will be specific with you about what they're aiming for. The good news is if they throw out a reference that you're not familiar with, all you got to do is pull up YouTube or Spotify and go listen.
Yeah.
It's so easy now to access whatever the reference point is, but even before we get to that point, just really listening a lot and developing skills in all these different genres it's critical. It's hard to even calculate how important that is.
Yeah, and I almost, of course, you start saying things like this and you sound like that old guy, at the gas station that you used to roll up to when you were a kid, always talk about the good old days. But, there's something to be said for only having an LP or a cassette or a CD or even just a old school iPod, which I still own one, and people laugh at me every time I pull it out. I use it every day when I work out. It's started acting up and not syncing with my iTunes anymore. So I'm kind of bummed about that. But go ahead.
What is working out? I'm not familiar with it.
What is this thing you speak of?
Wait.
And I very much enjoy not having a screen attached to it, not having the internet attached to it, and just being able to it be me and a device. Now, whether that device be an LP or that device be a cassette or an MP3 on an iPod, whatever that may be, just having that and you disconnected from the world and being able to dive in and listen. I feel like almost that has become a lost, I don't want to say art, but it really is an art, the art of just zoning out and listening to, becoming obsessed with whatever that album is or whatever that song is, and trying to figure it out with no other tools around except your ears. I don't know, maybe that was just an experience I had, but I feel like for a lot of my students, it's missing in their education.
I took drum lessons. I took percussion lessons. I had a teacher that insisted I learn marimba, which I remember thinking, if this is what I have to do to make a living, I'm
out.
I didn't enjoy marimba. I did enjoy timpani because you're hitting things.
Right.
Marimba's far too musical and beautiful for. But the thing, I've totally lost my train of thought. I brought all that up thinking about something, and I've totally forgotten what I was going to say. You can edit all this out, right?
Oh yeah, we're talking about Pokemon.
No, don't do that. It's not going to get me back. What was I know what it was. So I took all these lessons and I did all this study. My dad made me do piano because he could tell I was a little bit of an arranger, but also he knew, okay, your primary instrument is drums, but I want you to have sort of a melodic sense of all this. So I did that. But really, when I sat down to practice drums, what I was doing when I finished, 30 seconds of rudiments, they tell you to do that 30 minutes to an hour a day. I do that for 30 seconds or maybe 2 minutes, and then put on headphones, put in a cassette tape. Okay, that dates me. This is going back to the 80s. Stuff I would take off an LP. I would make cassettes so that I could go, and I would anything that I liked, I was playing to the track, trying to memorize it. What is Jeff Porcaro doing? What is Steve Gadd doing? What's John Robinson doing? Steve Jordan, all these legends, icons that I was just crazy about the way they played. I was trying not only to learn their parts, but what were they feeling? I was trying to kind of absorb as much of what they were doing as possible. So in a sense, that may have been my greatest education as a drummer, was trying to mimic some of that stuff, as opposed to all of the more intellectual stuff, which also is very necessary. But just going back to your point about listening and absorbing all this stuff, it really is just so important.
Yeah. And they, you know, and I talk to so many students and drummers that feel that practice, you know, this thing can only be done here, you know, and so it's a very limited idea of what you know, music is, which music is about life, art is about life, you know, paintings are about things that we're trying to express, you know, in a visual medium that we experienced on an emotional medium, if that makes sense. You know, and to me, music's the same way, something we experienced, we're trying to sonically portray what that is. And I was talking about, you know, Steve, I was kind of tie this in the conversation we were having with Steve, and what Raymond Weber told me, a fantastic drummer from down in New Orleans. And whenever he was trying to explain what, you know, what playing Brick House was like, you know, the popular song, he said, you know, you can't play that song. He said, you gotta, you know, that song's about, he said, I picture this fine, big black woman walking down the street, you know, she's a brick house. He said, I gotta get in the mindset of what is this song? You know, what are we playing, and how can I, you know, convincingly convey that emotion or whatever that is that the song is talking about. So no, I just think it's a very, you know, all too often they just separate, you know, the drums from everyday life, when in reality so much more of learning could happen whenever they if they would consider practice away from the kit a valid part of their education.
You know, we start to become good musicians when, in part, when we can start to incorporate life experience into what we're playing.
Mm-hmm.
Music is art, it's worship, it's love, there's so many different things about who we are as people that come out in the way we express ourselves on the instrument that we play. And so that's what Raymond was saying to you in a different way, that there are certain things that are conjured up in us when we're playing a different song, you know, from song to song, style to style, and that's really important. And you don't get any of that if you don't begin to embrace kind of that holistic approach to the instrument.
Yeah.
Understanding that it's part of your life and not just this thing that you do over here on the side.
Yeah. And that's, you know, that's when people have asked me, because my son took up drums maybe six months ago, something like that. It's been fun to kind of watch him. And they said, have you tried to get your kids, you know, have you pushed an instrument on them, or have you? And I said, well, I don't think that's really how music works. You know, I don't think we force art out of anyone by forcing it on them. And I told him, I said, you know, the way I got my kids interested in music, and whether they stay interested or not is totally up to them. I don't care. I'm proud of them either way. But I said, I actually hung out with them and listened to music. And I said, and they liked me because Dad would turn the volume up to 35 in the van and roll the windows down, and Mom wouldn't do that. I said, so we just turned it up to 35, and, you know, I listened to what they wanted to listen to. I, you know, put on some of the stuff that I thought was good, and we talked about it, and we, you know, yelled it out the windows. I said, that's how they got into music. And to me, that's a bigger hook point, you know, hook, line, and sinker than, you know, let me show you this practice pad and what you can do with these rudiments.
Yeah, we'll get to that eventually, but let's get them hooked in through the love of the craft of it instead of, or the art of it rather, instead of getting into all the intellectual hold off. they'll come to that eventually.
Yeah, we got plenty of time to bore you with that. No worries. That's amazing. Well, I appreciate you being a part of this and, taking the time and really helping everybody learn a little bit more about what you do.
Well, this is so much fun. I know everybody that you've asked to be part of this is really grateful to do it. So I should be thanking you. So
It was a blast. Well, I appreciate you. All right, so now I get to talk about why I played what I played on this track. This track was a lot of fun. Now, one of the things, and I talked with Scott about it, whenever I first heard the track, my first initial reaction, if I would have been on like a proper session with this, I would have suggested, hey, I think you should use programmed drums, because it was really what I was feeling. Like I was getting that vibe from the music, like it needed to. But you kind of go forth with this session as if the artist wants, acoustic drums. Now, we were given a reference of the 1975, who's an artist. You can go listen to them. And I know them very well from their first full-length album, as well as their EP before that. I don't know much of them after that. So that was kind of my reference point for that. And the first thing I did was I just listened to the song. That's what I always try to do with songs. I just try to listen to them and I see if there is anything that comes up while I'm listening. I don't try to conjure up anything. I just see while I'm listening if like in the back of my brain there's something that I hear going and be like, oh wow, I need to write that down. So immediately with that, I wrote this kind of broken hi-hat type of a pattern. I wound up not using that exact one, but that idea did make it onto the track. And so whenever I'm listening to something, I try to listen to it from just a musical standpoint and hear who's the star, where do we need to go, where's the energy, all of that stuff. I wanted to leave some space up front. And, and I still question if I built it correctly, how I should have. I may have waited a little too, if I would have been doing that, especially if I would have played that live, I would have come in a little bit sooner for that energy. But I think it works well for the recording for me. And it's a much different take than the others did. I did this very much from if I was in this band, and not if I was a session drummer. I did this from a standpoint of like, if I was in this band, what would I do as the drummer of this band? And that seems like that's not a big mental difference, but for me, it is a difference. So there's a difference when you're in an indie band and you're just going for what you feel like sounds proper. And then there's a difference whenever a label gets involved. and you feel like you need to be shooting for some type of popularity meter, if that makes sense. So you need to kind of make your parts fit this mold of what could be popular. It's different than when you have a session going on. It's an artist and it's featuring the vocals. It's different than, whenever I go in like on a country tune, you're featuring that story of that song. And in a band, you're featuring that story too. But in a band like the 1975, the drumming is just as intricate with that band as the lyrics are, as the guitars. All of those things kind of really play together. And so that was kind of the headspace I went into of like, I'm in a band and this is our song, instead of like I'm a session musician. And that was kind of how I rectified myself with not using electronic drums on that. And then for listening, I always, whenever I get something like this, I always try to find a couple reference points to listen to. And my listening times are usually while I'm in the car, or especially while I'm working out. If it's up tempo, if it's like, some like Sigur Rós or something I can't, Ray LaMontagne, so I cannot work out to, then I'll listen to that at other places while I'm mowing the grass or something. But I try to take that found time. Sorry, I'm scratching my hands here. I think I got it in Poison Ivy. That's pretty awesome. So I try to take that found time and really reclaim it. So for this, up to this, I was listening to, I decided to listen to the 1975, obviously. I was listening some Mute Math, but some of their newer stuff, the newer, even more electronic stuff than they had done. Some reggae, actually, the album Kaya from Bob Marley was on a playlist that I was listening to. That's a great album, by the way, if you haven't listened to it. And then as well, I was listening to a little bit of Stuart Copeland, The Police. And so those were kind of the references that were kind of milling around in my head. And I decided I went harder in the direction of that band that was referenced than some of the other players, I think, although I think Scott does a fantastic job of straddling it and really capturing the vibe of that band, but still, putting his spin on it. So the verses, if I was going strict 1975, we wouldn't have any ride cymbal. There would be several things that I wouldn't do. But I did some of those ride cymbal builds. And as well, on the verse, it's a very typical kind of a broken pattern with some toms in there that you would hear very sparse on their music, as well as going into the chorus. There is a 16. He loves 16-note hi-hat patterns with some various accents there, and then a displacement of the snare here and there. So you hear this zat zat on the second measure of that. I believe it's the second measure if I'm remembering right. It's been a little while since I tracked it. So that was kind of where I took that. And then for the bridge, I wanted that energy to continue. And so if you listen back, you can hear I kept the upbeats going on the hi-hat and then took it to a quasi halftime-ish, but instead of 3, it's on 4 where that hit is in that bridge, and then just played it out. And had a ton of fun. So I tried to weave some of his, I like to call them drumisms. Each player has their drumisms, their things that they like, their own individual quirks or twitches or whatever they do. Each person, I had a college professor once that actually walked out of his class. It was the first class, and it was like the first 5 minutes, and he had said 60 something times. And I was like, all right, I'm gonna bounce on this one. I can't do this the whole semester. And so that was one of his quirks. He said and I'm sure I have my quirks as well. One of my notice whenever I'm on video is I adjust my shoulders a good bit. Another one you'll notice is I pull at the bottom of my shirt. I don't know why I do these things, but they're quirks that I do. So everybody has their quirks in their drumming too. And sometimes those can really work to our strengths. They become part of our vocabulary. And then sometimes we have to look at them and go, there was a quirk that I had in my younger days. I remember specifically being pointed out where I'd be playing doosh, ba, zoom, ba, da, da, ba, doosh, ba, doosh, ba, doom, ba, da, da. I would do this ta-da on the upbeat of 4. And there was like this little hiccup. And I think those are great whenever you use it. But when they're used too much, it's like you're saying too many times, right? So sometimes we notice those and we have to fix them. And sometimes we go, no, you know what? I'm okay with that. That's kind of like my thing. And that's an okay thing to do as well, kind of put your stamp on it. And I remember multiple times throughout my career of noticing things. I remember at one point, which is not really related to this, I was making too many drum faces. But the reason it annoyed me was because it was actually, I was tensing up from making those faces. I think some drum faces are good, but then I think some of them actually get in the way of our playing and make us a little bit tense. And so anyway, that's kind of a thing of noticing what you do. But those are some of the things that I did and kind of my mind frame. If I went back to do it, I would actually probably veer a little bit further from the influence of it. And that Scott and I, we talked about that. It's very easy to go down that rabbit hole too far and draw too much from that well to where you sound too similar to what they're doing, to where it doesn't sound like you anymore. And I think I kind of hit borderline there for my tastes. If I went back, I would kind of add some big wash your ride cymbals and all that stuff. But that's hard to say what you would do going back, because you've heard 3 other fantastic versions of the song. So I'm just happy to be hanging out and being able to be in the company of fantastic players like Scott and Steve and just, you know, being able to play with them, and obviously Kenny. I don't want to leave him out. So, but anyway, hopefully you have enjoyed this series as much as I have. Hopefully you've learned something from it. Let me know, because I would love to produce some more of these.